Good morning, Coldwell Banker George Realty. And I was going to check and see if Peter Camp's here. He may be in a meeting. Okay, I believe he's still in his meeting. So welcome. I'm Michelle Olsen, and I'm going to have the pleasure of reviewing the grid with you today. I think it's a great process of how they made the contract so that it's easy that we go through it and not miss things. So this will be a review for some. But like I was saying before I unmuted myself, every day I believe there's always something to learn. So it's an interesting process. So today we'll be going through the grid. We'll touch on the liquidated damages clause. So I'm going to get started. So what I did, if you look on the screen, these are going to be the pre-attached disclosures that come up with the contract when you so you got your agency disclosure. These automatically populate fair housing, possible representation of more than one seller. That's an auto population, and wire fraud. Okay, so those auto populate when you're creating your document. So now we're going to get into the grid section. We're going to go over pages 1 through 3, just to refresh all of us, including myself. So let's get started on the grid. So this is the California Residential Purchase Agreement and Joint Escrows Instructions. So the date prepared is the date you're typing it up. Your buyer goes here. The offer is from the buyer. The property to be acquired, you fill all this out, including the assessor's parcel number. So you come down here, the agency, even though you've already done an agency disclosure, we need to reconfirm it on this document. So make sure that the seller's broker's firm, the seller's agent, buyer's broker firm, buyer's agent, that all the license numbers are correct. Coldwell Banker George Realty license number, my license number, the other company's license number, and their agent's license number. So in this case, I'm representing the seller and Sam Mann is representing the buyer. But if this was Coldwell Banker George Realty down here and Sam Mann was with our firm, we would become dual. So regardless if it's two different agents, if you are representing Coldwell Banker George Realty, if we're both from the same firm, you would check as dual, not seller and buyer. Okay. So we're going to start with the grid. This is the allocation of costs. So this one's fairly simple. Now, if you're referencing these in a counter, I would type, because these all belong to paragraph 3. So if I want to reference this in a counter offer, for instance, the purchase price, I'm going to type 3A purchase price and amend it however I need to in the counter offer. And if you look at this paragraph number, this is really nice because this is referring you to the body of the contract where you can read more about that particular line item. So you reference it 3A. If you want to read more about this particular term or line item, they're referring you to the paragraph to go ahead and read in the body. When we're making offers, I suggest anyway that we have a residential purchase agreement that we've read and just refresh it and highlight things. If you have any questions, we'll always be here to answer them or find the answers for you. So 3A purchase price, fill that in, or if it's all cash, you're going to fill in the price, and if it's all cash, make sure you click that box. Close of escrow, click the box if you want 30, 40 days after acceptance. Sometimes on cash, it's a little bit less on the days. Maybe it's 20 days. So click the box and put days after acceptance. Or if they have a date that they prefer, the buyers, you can insert a date. Now, if these dates fall on a legal holiday or a weekend, then they're going to move to the next business day. Okay. So, but that does count days. It's just if the last day falls on a weekend or a holiday, it'll move to the next day to close. Okay. So expiration of offer. This used to be at the very back when we wrote the offers. So now it's right up front, which is really nice. So 3 calendar days after all buyer's signature, or put the date in here at 5 p.m. So this is your expiration. You can let it just default to the 3 calendar days at 5 p.m. Or if you want to shorten that or lengthen it, you can go ahead and insert a date and a time, a different time. So the initial deposit, as we all know, in residential agreements, usually the seller is going to look for 3%. And why is that? Because 3% is the maximum allowed on the liquidated damages clause. We'll go into a little bit of that later in the training after the 3 pages. So the initial deposit, you fill in your amount here. It's going to calculate the percentage here automatically. So you just need to put your dollar amount here. That's an auto calculate.
You don't like it.
And if, oh, can we mute ourselves? And then this is the only line item that you're going to see that falls to business days. Okay. The rest are going to be calendar days. The initial deposit goes into escrow within 3 business days, or if you've amended it those days, by wire transfer. Now you can amend this here. You can check it and put money order, personal check, but bear in mind that that is up to escrow if they will accept that type of payment. If they do not want to accept a money order or a check, a personal check, which probably most of them do not want to, then it's going to revert back to wire transfer requirement. So if escrow cannot accept this payment type way here, it's going to revert back to wire transfer on that initial deposit amount. So just bear that in mind. Normally we are wire transferring. And if you notice up top, the wire transfer disclosure did auto populate. It's a good time when you're going over, especially the initial deposit, to go over the wire transfer form with them so they understand. Now, increased deposit, it can happen. I haven't seen it a lot in residential, but it does happen. So if you happen to be providing an increased deposit and it automatically defaults to upon removal of all contingencies, or you insert a date or another contractual happening here, maybe, you know, you want to put another contractual term that then you're going to remove the, you know, increase the deposit. If you do increase the deposit, you need to submit a DID form, and I'll have all of these attached to the first page so you can see it. A DID form is the increased deposit, but what that form does is it brings that amount into the liquidated damages portion. So let's say up at the top, they only did a 2% at the beginning, and then they were going to increase by 1%. You want to make sure you cover that with a DID form. The DID form does not come in. You would check the increased deposit when you're preparing your offer and put the amount, but the DID form does not come into play until that actual increased deposit is made. So I'm going to show you the form. I've got it hooked up right after this. So just be aware of that you need the DID on any increase. Now, let's say we had a $500,000 property, just as an example, and we put in $10,000 as our initial deposit, and then we did an increase deposit here and brought it in on the DID form, but the increase was $7,000. So I checked the increase, I put the DID form into play, everybody has executed it, I added another $7,000. So 10 plus the 7 is 17,000. We have a $500,000 purchase. So how much would be liquidated damages? 3%. So even you brought in another 7,000 and it was on a DID, maximum, you only get your 15,000. So don't be afraid. If you bring in more than that, you're covered with civil code, as long as, let me add a caveat to that, as long as the buyer intends to occupy the unit. So this liquidated damages pertains to 1 to 4 units and the buyer's intent that they will be occupying a unit. Okay, so just bear that in mind. I would be in the habit, if I'm increasing a deposit, to do the DID form. Yeah, okay. So the loan amounts, you want to make sure this is filled in. I want to point out that they did change this recently. It used to be the default was 0 points, and then you could add in if there were points, but now they've ticking it back to, you need to fill in the points. So make sure, when I was listening to one of the lawyers on this, they've had cases where agents have forgotten to fill this in. So it becomes a question of, can you cancel, because of something in the loan, the rate went higher than you expected. So it's really important, agents, that we fill this in. I don't know of any of our agents that have missed it because we're very well trained, but just as a little tip, the hotline has seen where this has been missed. So the loan is going to be conventional. That is our default, or you can check for FHA, VA, seller financing, or if you have another method of financing. Now, when you check FHA, the FVAC and HID form are going to attach. As soon as I scroll through this page, I'm going to show you VA, the FVAC is going to attach. So right here, if FHA or VA is checked, you're going to deliver a list of lender repairs within 17 days. Now, when will you lender required repairs, excuse me. So that will come when the appraiser comes to the property. So what will they be looking for? Well, maybe there's a broken window. They're going to be looking for things of that nature, safety issues. Also, if they,
Michelle, sorry to interrupt, but quick question. When does the liquidated damages clause apply?
Okay, so the liquidated damage, and I'm talking residential, Paul, okay?
Yeah.
So we're not talking about commercial. We'll do that in another training. But liquidated damage clause applies if you initial it. So it can't just be one side initialing it. It requires a full execution, meaning buyer and seller are in agreement to utilize liquidated damages. Liquidated damages on our contract, paragraph number, 29? So the liquidated damages is addressing a buyer's default, okay? So a lot of buyers, and we don't want to be practicing law without a license, but a lot of buyers or sellers are going to ask us. We can tell them, sometimes buyers or sellers want to sign it, sometimes they don't. We can ask them if they want to check with their legal counsel. But most of the time they're going to initial, because this handles the buyer default. So if there's a default, you have a set amount of 3%. So the rule on liquidated damages, so good, I'll go through some of this on the training I had. So the rule on the liquidated damages is whatever is in the escrow has been deposited, or, a maximum up to 3%. So in my previous example, I said 17,000 was in escrow, but only 15, it was 15,000 for the 3%. So if you execute on a liquidated damages clause, you would need to return the 2,000 and keep the 15. But again, this requires everybody signing it. And if you did an increased deposit, to bring it in through the DID, so that that amount incorporates into the liquidated damages as well. But the rule is, per civil code, it's 1 to 4 units. I'm talking about only residential right now, 1 to 4 units. And if the buyer at the time of offer intends to occupy a unit. Does that explain it to you?
So what you're saying is then the seller would keep that deposit if you do not, move forward with the terms and conditions of the contract?
Well, it's the seller. Okay, so you have to notice perform. It's the way the liquidated damages would be dispersed if that ever happened, and we hope it doesn't, that we don't have that kind of problem. But if it does, it's dispersed with a judicial decision. So it's either mediation, arbitration, or a judge. So you can't just take the money out of escrow. Of course, it has to be signed by all parties and agreed upon. So if you're not reaching mutual agreement on releasing that money, it could go to an arbitrator or judicial for their opinion, for their ruling. So
Got
as
it.
agents, we don't rule on that. We just have to know that, what the liquidated damages means. If it's an investor. So if I go back and I give you that example, and it was an investor that doesn't have the intention of occupying, for instance, then on my first example, they may be entitled to the whole 17,000. And when I say maybe, because I'm being careful with my language, because again, everybody has to be in agreement, and the liquidated damages is not automatically released to the buyer. That has to be mutually agreed upon. Okay. And I have some other forms to show you that as well. So I
Perfect.
hope I've answered most of your questions, Paul.
Yes.
Okay. So here, if you have additional financed amount, fill it in here. It's kind of like the other box up top, and it does automatically show it's conventional if it's seller financing, check, or what other method. So additional financing, you're going to want to fill this in completely, and if there's points and things of that. Now, here you go, occupancy type defaults to primary. So primary. So that means that the liquidated damage, if all parties initialed it, would apply. Okay. So investment or secondary could also be checked. So so here I pulled in the forms because I'm training, and sometimes if I mention a form, maybe you haven't had a chance to use them or haven't had to. So if the top of the contract is not filled out properly with the proper licenses, you're going to use a confirmation of real estate agency relationships. Normally, if I would notice a mistake, I would go ahead and fill this out and flow it back through a counteroffer, because I cannot correct that section of the contract with a counteroffer. I need to supply this form. So I'm going to flow it back to the buyer in a counteroffer and check that this is attached to make the corrections. Maybe they had a typo on one of the numbers or whatever, or maybe they didn't check some of these. So if you need to correct that, it's super easy, confirmation of real estate agency relationships. So just go ahead and correct it with that, and everybody acknowledges receipt of the copy of this confirmation. Okay. So delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages addendum, since we talked about it, I did want to pull it in and just show you the form real quick. So right here, everything's filled out. You're depositing on the date, an additional sum of, and how you're probably going to wire it payable into escrow. And the buyer hereby increases the total deposit to, so now it's what you originally had in plus your additional. You're going to put that number here. And you see here, this is how it brings it into liquidated damage. This is the language that has to be on this to bring this into liquidated damage. Now, if you check it's not part of it, then it's not. But here's the language for liquidated damage. But I would always be in the habit, like I said earlier, if I am doing an increased deposit, I'm going to be providing this form. Okay. Just so we're in the habit. And we should not be taking an additional deposit from the buyer. Okay. It doesn't go to the broker, our brokerage, we want it to go straight into escrow. Okay. So buyer and seller would sign. Uh-huh.
On that number 2.
Yes.
Not or is not. How do you check that one? No.
Well, okay, so Jeffrey's asking, would I check is not? Maybe I already have 3% in and I don't want to, but I would just leave it, because civil code, as long as you intend to occupy it at the time of the offer, residential 1 to 4, it's a 3% max. But if you're putting in more money for some reason, most people won't. But if you do, and you're well beyond your liquidated damage 3%, and everybody has initialed it, so it does apply, you could check is not, but I would probably just leave it. Most people, I don't think, will deposit over the 3% unless there's some specific reason why they want to. Okay. So FHA, VA, a mandatory clause. This is a required form if you check that box. So I just wanted to bring this in and show you. Here's where you fill in where the property would appraise, the purchase price. There's a little bit of a special thing with FHA, VA. The appraisal can stay in effect regardless of if you remove that contingency. They have a little bit higher protection. So Make sure that you're explaining this to your seller, but I haven't seen too many problems. The one thing with FHA or VA is more like they're going to look if you have chipped painting, maybe there's a lot of chip painting or things like that. So if you are going to entertain these kind of offers and you're representing the seller, kind of do a walk around and look for little safety issues and, you know, try to get them corrected before the appraiser comes. And then also make sure, of course, your smokes, carbon monoxide strapping on your water heater is done. Okay, so we can go over in more detailed disclosures, but since I'm mentioning these in the grid, I'm just pulling them in for you. So for your protection, get a home inspection is required for all FHA transactions. And if you check that box that's FHA, this is auto populate for you. Okay, so just a simple form saying that we recommend a home inspector and they sign it. Okay, FHA does require that. So I brought in the request for repair because I wanted to show you that you can handle the request for repair is really nice because now on item number 3, if the FHA or VA does require some repairs, you can list them here, or you can attach them or list them here. Okay, so that's just showing you the form. And another thing I want to go back and show you is section 1 and 2 termite. This is really nice. Now this form is so all inclusive. If you are requesting section 1 or section 2 termite to be paid for by the seller on other transactions, you're going to check here, okay? And provide the report. So I'm going to keep going. Now we're on the page 2 of the grid. So right here, seller credit, if any, to buyer. So you're going to check the box here if it's applicable and insert your amount. So as I said in prior training, make sure if you're inserting a credit amount that you have asked the lender. This automatically applies to closing costs, or if you have other. Especially if you check other too, make sure you're clearing that through the lender. So if you're asking for a seller credit, let's make sure that the lender allows that amount. It's an allowable amount because if you get to the closing table, you put in 10,000, but the lender's only going to allow 8,000. Guess what? That credit's only 8,000. But if you knew that in advance, there would be different ways that you could handle it. Like maybe you reduce the price by 2,000 so they get their whole 10,000. So make sure if you are doing a seller credit request, that you have talked to the lender to make sure that that full amount can flow through it. Okay. So there was a case that came up where you see the seller credit should go here. Somebody typed it here, seller to credit buyer $3,000 towards closing costs at close of escrow. Another agent did that. So the listing agent did not notice this. So guess what? It does apply. So be very careful. Look through this contract, get your highlighter out. I love my yellow highlighter. When I get an offer in, that thing is highlighted out. I highlight everything that has a check mark, even if it's a pre-check mark. I'm looking at everything. So even if they didn't put it here and they put it here, guess what? It still applies. So just watch out, for that. So we're here on G3. Seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker. So if this is checked, that means that the buyer had a prior agreement. The buyer's agent, pardon me, had a prior agreement with their buyer. Maybe the buyer was being generous and said, oh, I'll pay you 4% if you locate the property, but the MLS is only offering a 2.5. So the buyer's agent can ask here.
Well, I reached connect hearing.
Oh, hello. Okay, so the buyer's agent can check here and see if the seller will pay the difference between 2.5 to 4. It's not 4 plus 2.5. It's merely the difference. So you can try and see, but it has to be prior agreement that the buyer's agent made with the buyer, and the seller is going to ask for a copy, and it will all be done in this form here, the CAR form. Okay, so that's probably not going to happen much, but I just wanted to point it out to you.
Question.
Yes.
Can you go back to the repair?
Oh, okay, what's your question?
Pertaining to the, it's mandatory for FFA and DA loan that you have to follow the requirement for repair because they're very strict, right?
Okay, when you
So-
say it's mandatory just repeating it, mandatory to follow the request for repair from the lender, the required lender repairs on FHA or VA. Okay, it is mandatory for the loan, but the seller does not have to agree, but bear in mind, maybe there wasn't a lot of offers on the house, or maybe there was. So they're gonna either agree because they want to get it sold and maybe it's only a couple $1,000. I don't know. I'm just giving you an example. They want to roll the dice and go back on the market. So I'm just saying that, that is up to the seller, but there are ramifications and they need to think of everything that makes sense for them. Yeah.
So on the follow-up on that, who is the requirement? The appraisal report will do the.
Yeah, the lender, yes, they'll be out at the property, their appraiser, and if they note things that are of safety issues, an active infestation on termite, they'll note it. Okay,
Not the home inspection, it's the appraisal.
the appraiser, yeah.
Okay.
So verification of all cash. So you can either attach it to the offer or 3 days after acceptance or amend the days here. But all of us that have been in business for a while, we know our offer is much stronger if we attach it to our original offer. When you have a verification of all cash, please make sure that that verification of all cash is matching the name on the offer. We have had offers come in where it was somebody else's VP, verification of all cash, even though it was a family member, they weren't one of the buyers. So please make sure that it's current. And what I consider current is within the last 30 days, because that's normally how any kind of bank statement or stock statement will run. So I want it current within 30 days, and I want to make sure it is matching the name on the offer. Okay. Or else I'm going to be having to ask the other agent, where's the verification of all cash for the person making the offer? So verification of down payment and closing costs. Obviously, if you're all cash, that wouldn't be included in that verification. You want to make sure they have sufficient funds for closing costs in that. And for offers with loans on them, make sure that that you're matching the names. Make sure it's a current verification of down payment and closing costs. I would always suggest you attach it to the offer. You're going to be in a much stronger position, because if you don't, surely the listing agent is going to be calling you, or they may just counter it. So when I counter something that I need back, like let's say I didn't get that verification, if I'm writing a counter offer, just something I have done over the years, I'm going to write it like this: buyer to submit to seller, verification of down payment and closing costs, and return with signed counter offer. I don't want to be chasing them. I don't want them just to sign the counter offer and not provide me the document that is the seller is going to need to make a decision. So you can ask them to write it right in your counter offer to return it with that counter offer. Okay. So verification of loan application attached to the offer, which is the best way, or you can amend it to days after acceptance. So you have a pre-qualification, pre-approval, fully underwritten pre-approval. So talk to the lender of your buyer, see how high of a letter you can get. Obviously, the best is the fully underwritten pre-approval, but call the lender and see where they're at in the process. You want to see how much of their financials they've checked and get the applicable letter. Now, when you get the letter, again, make sure the date makes sense and the amount, because sometimes the buyers, especially in some of the markets we've been in, they've been going around, doing their best to get accepted on offers. So they may have, a letter that is way above the asking price, which you don't want to present. You want one close to the asking price. So make sure that the letter from the lender makes sense, and they can give you a new letter for this offer very timely, very quick. Make sure that the date is current as well. Okay, so the final verification of condition of property, which we bring in at the end on a VP, I want to spend a little bit of time on this. Let me look at my time. Okay, so right here it says 5 days prior to COE. Now, sometimes you may want to amend this. Maybe you want it to be 10 days. And why is that? Because you want to go over there. Now, especially if you have negotiated repairs that the seller is going to make by close. Even if I've had an email event and I've asked for receipts, I'm going to ask for the receipts of the repair. Even if it's a Home Depot receipt, I'm going to ask, and I'm going to email the agent and say, have all repairs been made according to the request for repair? And so they're going to answer me. But when I'm going over for the final verification of condition, I'm going to be looking at those repairs. I'm not going to be climbing on the roof or into attics, but if it's something simple I can look at, I will look. Otherwise, I also have my email chain to show that they said that those were complete with some receipts. So you may want to amend this to 10 days prior. And the other thing that you want to, on the seller side, you want to prepare the seller for closing the property and delivering it. We want to deliver it with no trash. Please don't leave trash on the property unless the buyer has agreed. Like, even if it's stacked neatly, it's best to leave the property clean. Old paint cans, paint thinner, things of that nature in the garage that the buyer would have to take someplace special to dispose of. We want to make sure all of that's gone unless the paint was paint for the house that the buyer agreed that they want to keep. So prepare your seller for how to deliver the property. When you do your final verification, for me, when I thought about it longer, I probably want this to be 10 days prior because I want to make sure my repairs are done. I want to make sure that they're clearing the property, you know, of all things. And the other thing I'm going to look for, if I asked for that refrigerator, I'm also going to put that in my email, and the refrigerator is staying put. I'm going to be looking for the refrigerator. So things like that. Now, the buyers do need to attend this. The buyers on the property. Now, what if they can't attend it? They're out of state or something. There's a way to handle that on the VP. There is a box where they can waive it. We don't recommend that. But if you're in a situation where they just can't come, then you need to check the box on the VP. And I have this attached to this page, and I'll show it to you that they've waived it. If your clients can't make it, I'm still going to go to that final verification as their agent. I'm going to go and I'm going to just take a look. Okay. So that's how we're going to handle that. And if it stops a lot of problems, especially if somebody, let's say you thought the drapes were going to be there. And I did have this happen, by the way, and they took down all the drapes and the buyer was in love with the drapes. So we had to get the drapes back. You know, you need to leave those.
What's VP?
Verification of condition of property. Assignment request. I really like that they have now added this as a line item, 17 days after acceptance. Now, if it's a buyer's wholly owned entity or trust, you know, this isn't going to apply. This is if you're bringing in a different entity, a different buyer, an assignment, then you need to execute on this. Now, when you bring in an additional assignee, please make sure that you are printing the full package, the offer, escrow instructions, all of the disclosures, no matter wherever you're at in the process, make sure that they've initialed those. They're not going to delay any contingencies. It's just merely the fact that they've seen it. They're not going to delay your contingencies. The buyer's merely assigning to someone else, but you want to make sure as an agent that you've provided them a set of the documents. I would ask for their initials on each document, okay? So that verifies that they received it and they saw it, okay? So that has to be done within 17 days after acceptance, or you can amend the days. So the only two contingencies on this document that you can remove with a check mark is no loan or no appraisal contingency. So if it's cash, it's going to be no loan. Maybe even if they're paying cash, they're still going to want an appraisal. So bear that in mind. Ask your clients, do you want the property appraised or not? So even if it's all cash, most of the time they're not going to, but sometimes they want an appraisal. Okay. So just bear that in mind. It defaults to 17 days after acceptance, and as well as the appraisal. You're going to notice in this grid section now coming down, they've made all of these, for the most part, 17 days after acceptance, so it's easy to remember the time frame. So look here, they're reminding us removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in the FBAC. So there, you know, it's a little bit different when you have the FHA-VA a mandatory clause in play. That appraisal contingency will stay in effect. And I have closed FHA and VA. I haven't had a problem with that, but just in case the property value went down and they pulled another check on it right before closing, just be aware of that. Investigation of property, 17 days after acceptance, that is where you're going to have your termite, if you want a roof inspection, anything of that nature, professional home inspector come in. So you're going to want to do that within 17 days or if this has been amended. So make sure that you don't have, if the listing agent counters you and this is too low, the days are too short for you to get everything down, have a discussion with them, because sometimes we're at the mercy of the schedule of others. So usually we can move pretty quick, but make sure, call your home inspector, your termite company. If you need a roof inspection, make sure, or a pool inspector, make sure you're calling all those people to make sure that you can get this done quickly, because you want to get it done right away and you want to have time to review the reports so that you can do a request for repair if you plan on doing that. Informational access to property. Now, this is not a contingency. 17 days after acceptance, I learned something new when I was going to an additional training. You probably want to match these. So if this is amended to 10, you want to take this to 10. The buyer can come into the property. Let's say they want to go on the roof and you had this at 10 and this was at 17. It may make somebody uncomfortable if, oh wow, now they're looking at the roof, I wonder why. So it's best to just make these match. Yeah, be consistent with them. And you know, they can use this informational access to property for things like even measuring. Maybe they want to remodel the kitchen. Maybe they want to bring a contractor in to tell them how much that's going to cost. Okay, so just bear that in mind. Let's try to make these match if possible. Review of seller documents. You have 17 days after acceptance or 5 days after the delivery of such documents, whichever is later. So in the contract, the seller has 7 days to deliver the disclosures to you. But as listing agents, we want to make sure that we have those as quick as possible. I like to get them out within the first 2 to 3 days. So make sure, or if you have everything done, you can even return it when you return the counter offer in a separate email. Just send all the disclosures so that they have an idea. But make sure that you have all of those done as fast as possible. We don't want to be the reason that a contingency gets extended because we didn't do the paperwork. It is up to us to provide that paperwork to the sellers and have them complete it. We don't complete that for them. So preliminary title report, 17 days. We always ask that you, listing agents, from our company, we'd like you to order that up front because you want to be reviewing and looking at that title report for any liens or things of that nature, or ingress and egress issues, anything like that. You want to be checking the preliminary title report. And if you look up in the right-hand corner, you'll see your title officer. So you can call that title officer and say, hey, Miss Officer, I already reviewed the report. I don't see anything that's drawing my attention. Can you go over it with me and let me know if you notice anything? So make sure that you're getting that preliminary title report right up front. The buyer will appreciate it because they'll have it right away as well when you enter into contract. So get the preliminary, review it, call the title officer. There are instances around our area, San Gabriel, Temple City, San Marino, where there could be some very old HOAs laid into that title report. So you want to request a copy of those They're laid right into the title report, because there is a click where you can click and, hyperlink, but sometimes they're not there because they're super old. And a lot of times these older HOAs are not enforceable, but we don't know for sure. So we need to get those and have them reviewed as well. Okay. So if there's anything odd like that, you want to make sure you're reviewing it. Common interest disclosures, refer to the HOA disclosures. 17 days after acceptance for the buyer to review, or 5 days after delivery, whichever is later. If you're the listing agent, we always ask that you please try to get these ordered as soon as possible. I know it costs money. The HOA docs, anything that you need from the HOA, order them early. Ask your seller to please do that and put the money in. It'll save a lot of headache, because there are some HOAs, they don't care if you're on contract sometimes, and it could take 20 days. We don't want to be stressed out over something that could have been done earlier. So as a listing agent, please make sure you're ordering early if they are applicable to your transaction. So review of leased or liened items, like propane tank, solar systems, 17 days after acceptance. So the seller would provide contracts or anything like that. But what CAR did is they now have a solar form where the seller checks anything they know about that solar panel system, because they're all different. So it's a great form that they brought in, but I would also be asking for their initial contract, their original contract from the seller, so that you have that on file, because the buyer's going to want to see that so that they can make the calls and check on this themselves and make sure that it's something that they're willing to go, okay, to proceed on. So sell a buyer's property is not a contingency unless you check for the COP form here. I was listening to another training where agents are forgetting to check this. So make sure, that if they need to sell something to proceed with this one, make sure that's checked and the form is brought in automatically. So right here, you have removal or waiver of contingencies. Removal or waiver at the time of offer is against the agent advice. So sometimes people want to be really competitive and they start removing all the contingencies, but it is against our advice. If the buyer insists on doing that, let that be their idea and not yours, but also explain what that means to them so they fully are cognizant of what removing that contingency or all contingency really means. Excuse me, my session is going to expire, so I'm going to call Edgar to get this fixed. And if there's any questions.
Yes, I do have a question.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
It's gonna expire.
So what happens
Okay.
when the home inspector makes a notation on the report that signs of leaking are present, and then you get the transfer disclosure from the seller, and he doesn't mention anything about that sign of leaking? And also when the appraiser goes to the property and he doesn't also mention or call it out, and you see a big stain on one of the rooms on up in the ceiling, and the appraiser doesn't mention anything about it on the report. So it's kind of,
Okay, so for me, if you're talking about representing the buyer.
That is correct, representing the buyer.
Okay, so I would ask the listing agent if they notice that, and at any rate, at that point, you're going to want to get a better inspection on the roof, and see what's going on, and then request the repair. Maybe it just occurred with the new rain, but if it looks like an old stain, ask them, was there a leak up there that was fixed previously? And then talk to your buyer about it. Maybe the house is a good deal and the buyer's like, I'll handle it, but make the buyer aware of it. and let them know we can get a roof inspector if you want to research this further, because we are, we want to do the best for our clients. So I would have it inspected. I would also be asking the listing agent, hey, was there something, previously fixed? Because I noticed it looks like an old stain. Do you know what that is? Look at their
Yeah,
APID.
sometimes listing agents don't even care to find out anything. They just say, no, I don't know. Or I'll ask the seller. They always say, oh, I'll ask the seller. So if the seller on the transfer disclosure statement doesn't mention anything about it, what else?
Well,
Who else are we to ask?
put your question in writing to them, first of all, and ask them if they know if any previous leaks had been, fixed on the property, because you notice, you can't really say what it is, but you notice some stain on the ceiling, So go ahead and make sure that you're asking, and then your client needs to make a decision if they want to get a roof inspector over there, because you're still in your contingency period. And if you needed to extend it because you couldn't get an inspection over there in time, ask them to extend that contingency on that. Yeah, I would be really careful, because unless it's a great deal and your client wants to move forward, make them aware, and then ask the listing agent if they know anything further. If they're going to ask the seller, you could shoot a very friendly email saying, did you find anything out further from the seller, about what was discovered in the inspection report. But at any rate, you want to put a request for repair in.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah. So, and if that doesn't answer you fully, we'll address it further, Patrice.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
of
you.
course, anytime. Time of possession. So we're down here. So you see here, it's upon notice of recordation. So sometimes people will amend it to upon notice of recordation at a certain time, or you want a different date. Now, if the seller is going to stay in even COE, close of escrow, plus 1 day or 2 day, we're going to need to do an additional form. And I have those attached after this slide. So seller occupied or vacant units, COE, or if checked below, you check for 29 days or fewer, you're going to attach an SIP form, or if they're staying more than 30 in RLAS. Now, what if you don't know this when you're writing the offer? Make sure as a buyer's agent that you're asking the listing agent if there are any occupants other than the seller on the property. And occupants include adults that are there, whether they're paying rent or not. Maybe they have an uncle in a bedroom or something like that, or a niece. So make sure that you're asking if it's just the sellers that are in the property. I'm not talking about minor children, because, they're not adults. So of course they're going to take their minor children, but make sure that you understand if there's any occupants in the house other than the seller. If you find that there is, then ask the listing agent, request them to provide you with the information on that. Okay. So, and that's covering the TOPA. So the TOPA here is tenant occupied here, you check it. So if there is somebody there other than the people on title, make sure that you're getting a TOPA from the listing agent. Go ahead and ask them if there's anybody there other than the seller, okay, on title. That's a very important form, by the way, and I'll show it to you when we scroll down. Seller delivery of documents, as we discussed, you have 7 days after acceptance, or if you amended the days here, to deliver them to the buyer. Sign and return escrow holder provisions. I like that they put this here 5 days after delivery, or you can amend it, because we want to keep moving forward. When you get the paperwork from escrow, if you're not comfortable going over that with your buyer, you can ask your escrow officer for a meeting, and you can meet your buyer at escrow, and they can go over the escrow instructions for you and have it signed there, okay, for your buyer and seller. So if it's something you're not comfortable with and you'd rather go see your escrow officer, they'll be happy to sit with your client and you and get the escrow paperwork signed and explain any questions that they may have. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. See, it's very tight. It's 3 days after acceptance, or you can amend it. But I'm hoping that our agents have already been on the move getting these documents ordered so that we don't have any delay and cause the contingency periods to rise due to not having the HOA documents. So installation of smoke alarms, carbon monoxide water heater bracing, 7 days after acceptance, or you amend it. And the reason they're coming out quick on that is because if an appraiser comes out and we don't have the appropriate smoke detectors and carbon monoxide and the water heater's not braced, it may trigger a reinspection by the appraiser, and that costs money. So and you'll see further in the grid, it can be paid for by the buyer or seller or both, but normally a seller does install these things because they have access to the property. So if the seller agreed to have smoke alarms, carbon monoxide, and water heater braced, and it's not done when the appraiser gets there and triggers a fee, then the seller needs to pay that fee. Okay, not the buyer, if the seller agreed to have these installed. Evidence of representation authority, that's an RCSD. That means, let's say it's a trust or it's an entity that is buying the property. We need to know that the person signing it, the individual, has the authority to sign the offer. Of course, escrow is going to ask for further trust documents, and they'll most likely ask for some of the documents for the entity, but we need to cover our bases and make sure that we have a representation authority. You want to make sure the person signing at least signs that they can, they're authorized to sign. This is a verification of property condition that you do at the end of escrow. Right here, if checked, the buyer waives the right to conduct a final verification of property. Okay, and if the buyer does this, they're acting against the advice of the broker. But if they say, nope, I can't come, I'm not going to come, I just can't, they can't send uncle to do it. It's the buyer. Okay, of course, if you want to accommodate their uncle because the uncle's going to be their eyes, it's still a buyer waiver because it's not the actual buyer at the verification of property. Okay, so if that happens, make sure that you're checking that box. Solar advisor and questionnaire. This is really nice. So here, the seller will be answering all this. So it makes it a better decision and more informed decision by the buyer if they want to proceed, or if they have more questions about the solar and who to contact. So this is the SIP form that I mentioned. This is 29 days or less. Even if it's close of escrow plus 1 day, please make sure that you have this completely executed to protect everybody. Okay, it's just 2 pages. Tenant occupied property. That's your TOPA. So this is for use on residential only, 1 to 4 units. It has a lot of protections for the both parties, really. So fill this out. If there's somebody in the property that's 18 years old plus, paying rent or not, if they're not on title, make sure this form is filled out and that you have a copy. We can go over how to fill out forms at another training if anybody needs that. The rent cap just clause addendum automatically attaches to that TOPA.
Question. On the TOPA, 18 years old above, are those, do you have to include part of the TOPA, the daughter, or?
Yes, if they have, he's asking if they have an 18-year-old plus daughter living in the property. At 18, they're considered an adult. Yes, include that, please. Anybody that's not on the title, whether they're paying rent or not, include a TOPA, okay? So this is the residential lease after sale. I did not attach the whole agreement because it's like 6 or 8 pages, but that's intended if the seller is going to remain in possession for 30 or more days. You want to make sure that this is in place. So I think we're on, I'm sorry about the cricket, our thing was a little off today. So right here, we want to make sure that we're familiarizing ourselves as agents with paragraph 9, because it's going to outline in paragraph 9 all of the items that are to be left with the property. And then it'll also outline in that paragraph excluded items, but you're going to do some check marks as well. So make sure that you go over those paragraphs with your client, especially a listing agent, to make sure that they understand what is to be left. If it's something that is included in the contract that they want to exclude, make sure you're countering when you get an offer that and excluding that item. So you come down here, the only check that is pre-done for us is the bathroom mirrors. And that could be if they're hanging on a chain, affixed to the wall, not affixed to the wall, you know, anything like that, you need to leave them. So go ahead and be aware of this. If it was an antique mirror that they absolutely had to keep your seller, you're going to want to counter that out. Now, coming down here, let's say here, the buyer's agent checked for the refrigerator. And let's say that the listing agent didn't notice that, okay? But on the MLS, they had put in the agent remarks that the refrigerator shall be excluded from the sale. The contract drives. So if this was checked and they accidentally missed countering it out, and even though the MLS said that the refrigerator was excluded, the refrigerator is coming with the property unless the buyer agrees to, you know, take a credit or say, forget it. But make sure you are highlighting everything that they checked here, because as a listing agent, if you need to exclude something, you're going to need to counter that in an exclusion. So additional items included, there may be, well, here they have potted trees and shrubs. Maybe there's a potted plant, a huge potted plant on the porch that the buyer would like to keep. You can ask for it and see if the seller's willing to leave it. Maybe there's a water fountain, a set-in on the front yard that they love. You can ask for that. But make sure that if there's things checked here as a listing agent, you're really reviewing it, because even if you excluded something in the MLS, the contract is going to override that, because this is the term. Okay.
Michelle, can I say something?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I just recently had an issue where a listing agent obtained an offer. It got all approved, and then suddenly they get a call from the selling agent saying, hey, I don't see a stove there. And he goes, well, I never agreed to do the stove. And I had him pull the RPA, and on there, they checked that the stove was going to be included. So what
Right.
happened now? They had to now give them money to replace for the stove. And the
Right.
stove, there was a stove there originally, but it belonged to the tenant. And now the tenant had moved out and so on. So it's very important for them to review this section very closely.
Yeah, and the check marks. And remember, and I know you know this, Anna, but some appraisers, especially on your FHA or VA, hey, they're going to call out on that property, hey, there's no stove. So, you know, they're going to be asking for it in some instances to be installed. So just be aware. You can even ask, your own lender as a listing agent. You don't have to ask the buyers, but hey, do I have to put a stove on that property for a conventional loan, or will FHA or VA require it? In most cases for FHA or VA, they are going to require it. But Anna, I'm glad you brought that up, because this does happen. This is real life. So make sure you're reviewing this and giving it a thorough review with your highlighter. Always print this. I always keep it and I write on the top highlighted version, because I'm going to keep looking over it a couple of times to make sure that I didn't miss highlighting anything. In fact, I'll even be highlighting this pre-check, because I want to make sure I understand everything in this offer to the best that I can. Okay, thank you for that, Anna.
You're welcome.
Natural hazards zone disclosure report, including tax information. If you're representing the buyer, and normally it is going to be the seller will provide that. So click the seller box and check down here who you want it provided by. And environmental, I always check this because it gives you a little more information on the area. So go ahead and check this. It's not much more money, and it provides a lot of, comfort, and it gives you more information. It's not too much more money. So go ahead and check that. Okay. Report here. So if there's additional reports, so I saw a case where somebody wrote here, section 1, termite, and then this word is report, the seller would pay. So what does that mean technically? That means that all the seller has to do is provide a report. So don't put, if you want clearance up here, it's not a good idea to put it here because this is for reports, not for, section 1 termite clearance. The best way to handle it, I'm going to show you a section down below where you could add that if you must. But remember, the request for repairs now has check boxes for that, because in the past when they didn't have it and you're trying to get a seller to agree to a section 1 clearance, it's a blank check. They didn't know, how much it was unless they had a termite report on hand. So here, if you put section 1 termite report, that's not the clearance. Okay, so your language has to be tight, but these 2 lines here are for reports, not for things that are costing like a section 1 clearance. So I'll show you where you could put that if you must put it on the offer. I recommend, and it's up to you and your buyer, that you do it through a request for repair. Okay. Smoke alarms, carbon monoxide, water heater bracing. Normally the seller's going to go ahead and handle that because after all, they do have access to the property. So I would check that. These 2 boxes are very important. These governmental required point of sale inspection reports and report point of sale corrective and remedial actions. So when I went to the training, they are requesting that we not leave these blank. So check it to the seller if you represent the buyer. There could be a point of sale that you're not familiar with. Maybe a city has one or there's some report, but make sure that you're checking that box. Listing agents, make sure that you're checking. The title companies do provide a list, but also check on the city where the house resides or if it's county, and see if there are any point of sale inspection requirements, because you're going to need to provide that in most instances. The buyer most likely won't take responsibility, but sometimes they will. It just depends. It is a negotiating point, but please check these. Don't leave this blank because these will apply if it's applicable. If there's no requirement for inspection report, of course, it's not going to apply. Okay. Escrow
Question.
fee.
Sorry.
Hi.
So if there's a pre-sold inspection required, do we have to write it? Do we have to write it on the MLS? Do we have to?
No, but
okay.
no, not at all. But make sure that as a listing agent that you are well aware of what's required. Buyer's agent should also do that as a habit, check and see if it's required. I
Yeah.
like to know. I don't like surprises. And I know, Patrice, you're a lot like me. We like to research and make sure we don't have a surprise.
Yeah.
But when I went through the higher level training, they said, do not leave this blank. Critical. Check it to the seller if you're representing the buyer. Okay. Just so that's covered for you if they are applicable. Escrow fee, you have a few choices here, buyer, seller, both. Both means 50-50. Most escrow fees aren't 50-50. So you want to check each to pay their own fees. So that's their customary fees. So this is the box I would normally check. Escrow holder, you can put a seller's preference, not seller's choice, because there is an escrow company named seller's choice. So make sure there you're putting seller's preference. Or if you want an escrow holder, if you want to specify one, make sure you're spelling out the escrow company and the escrow officer, because the listing agent may have an escrow officer in that same escrow company. So if you have a preference and you're going to go for it and specify it, go all the way and specify the company and the name of the officer. Okay. Same here, title insurance. If different from escrow holder, if you want a certain title rep, put the title company and the name of the rep here so that you have specified it clearly. So owner's title insurance, generally the seller's going to pay for that title insurance. insuring the property in the sale. And the buyer's lender title insurance policy, you see it's an automatically goes to the buyer unless otherwise agreed.
Question.
Uh-huh,
On the title insurance and the escrow,
uh-huh.
so you're talking about the buyer's preference, right?
Right, but I would normally, it depends on how competitive the property is and the market. So sometimes you put seller's preference here and seller's preference here. Or if you want to specify, you specify, but you also put the name of the person, not just the company. You put your title officer, your title rep, or your escrow officer, along with the name of the company.
Or the buyer can say seller's preference.
Seller's preference, not seller's choice, since we have an escrow company named that. Okay, so we're down to county transfer tax and fees and city transfer tax and fees. Representing the buyer, this always gets checked to the seller. Most of the time they're going to pay for that, but again, anything can be negotiated. But if you're representing the buyer, I'm going to check to the seller. HOA fee for preparing disclosures. The HOAs do charge a fee in most cases, so the seller is specified to pay for that. The HOA certification fee is for the lender, and so the buyer would pay for that. Okay, so those are, anything's negotiable, but these default to the seller and the buyer. HOA transfer fees. I'm normally, if I'm representing a buyer again, I'm going to check it to the seller to pay those transfer fees unless otherwise agreed. And there's a move out fee. The seller will pay their own move out fee. If there is a move in fee, the buyer pays their own. Okay. And that only applies if separately billed or itemized with a cost in the transfer fee. So private transfer fees, seller, it defaults to seller. I usually leave that alone. Okay. So just let that default to the seller, but anything's negotiable again. So fees or costs right down here. So now, mind you, this does not say report. So you could put a fee or a cost thing that you're wishing the seller to pay for. On other terms, you could also put seller to provide buyer with Section 1 termite clearance. Again, we recommend that you handle that on your RR because the seller may not know how much that's going to cost. Home warranty plan, and they put this language in to be chose by the buyer, not the agents, by the buyer. So make sure that you're allowing the buyer to choose who they wish. And the coverage includes but is not limited to, type in here whatever you need to type in for the type of policy or whatever. Now, it's going to be buyer, seller, or both. That would be a 50-50. But if you're representing the buyer, normally you're going to ask for the seller to pay. They may counter it back to you, but at least you can try. So if the both is if seller or both is checked, the seller can specify on the counter a cost not to exceed, or if you're writing the offer for your buyer and you have an idea of what that policy is going to cost, you can put the amount there, not to exceed. Okay, issued by, put the name of the home warranty company. And again, I would also type out the rep's name, because if you have long relationships with people, you certainly want them to have the credit. So put the rep's name, or if the buyer, waives the home warranty plan, check that if that is applicable. Okay,
Michelle,
so
can I do
Yes.
a comment? Going back to Q16,
Oh, the
if you're
295.
using Zip Form Plus broker
Yep.
version, which everybody should be using it, it's to your benefit. It automatically populates compliance fee 295 if you're writing the purchase agreement, just to let you know. And why this is so important, because when your lender is accepting the terms for the new loan, if it's in the contract, they're not going to deny you letting the compliance be collected at closing from your buyer.
Yeah,
So you want to make sure that that's always there.
compliance fee, Q16 or Q17. And if you're representing the buyer, normally they're going to be paying their own compliance fee.
Correct.
Buyer compliance fee.
Uh-huh.
That's it.
Can you clarify further on the other term?
Yes.
Can you further clarify on the other term, some other term?
Other terms, whatever's not addressed above, like I said, if you had to put termite in here for Section 1 clearance, you could put it there. Now you also, thank you for asking, you want to make sure there's nothing in there when you're reviewing it as a listing agent that they didn't put a credit in there, a seller to credit. That's another box you're going to be looking. When you are reviewing these, make sure you are reviewing these blank boxes that they can just type things in, okay? But you could put, like, for instance, termite or things like that. What other terms that you need to bring into this offer that are not provided for up top, you type here.
As a buyer.
Yes. Okay. So this is just, so let's see. Yeah, that's it. So inspections. Yeah, so I just brought this in because it says right here that paragraphs 3Q1, 2, 3, and 5 only determines who is to pay for the inspection, report, test, or certificate, or service mention. So when that agent puts section 1 clearance up in those boxes, then it can be denied. So we just need to be careful of all of that. This is really a nice document because they've put everything up top so that we can all see it clearly. And I want to mention, if you are in a deal and you're a little bit uncomfortable, or you're new, or you're coming back into the business after a while, come and ask one of us. We have a lot of experience under this roof, so we're happy to help you. We can be your second eyes and give our suggestions and look over your offer. And so don't feel uncomfortable. We're here for you. As I always like to say in training, you're never alone at Coldwell Banker George Realty. We're going to be with you when you need us throughout the transaction. So don't feel like you're alone. If you have questions or you have any issues come up, if we don't have the answers, we're going to make sure we get those for you. So always rest assured that someone from management will be here with you. I'm happy to look over offers and counters. We have a manager that will do that. We have a broker. So don't ever feel alone. We're here to help you get your transactions closed. So with that, on the liquidated damages, I already explained that up top. That pertains to residential 1 to 4, and that the buyer intends to occupy at the time of the offer.
Excuse me, Michelle.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry, I have a question. You were talking about the compliance fee and the phone ring. Can you tell me where you put that on that form?
Okay, go ahead, Anna.
It's automatically, when using Zip Form Plus broker version, it's automatically populated under Q16. And it says compliance fee paid by the buyer, and then it will indicate $295.
Okay, I know about the $295, but I just wanted to know where to put it. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so is there any other questions, comments? Does anybody have a deal they need help on? You're always welcome to show one of the management team. We'll make sure we get all of the answers for you and help you along through that transaction. So does
One more
anybody?
question.
Uh-huh.
I'm sorry.
Oh,
So
go ahead.
let's say that the buyer decides to go and have the roof inspected. Do we have to revise our ABID? Let's say that I'm representing the buyer and my buyer decides to go and have the roof re-inspected. Do I have to revise my ABID, my agent visual disclosure?
Okay, Patrice, that's a really good question. I'm gonna call out on that and get information, but if I'm doing it, I probably would not, because that came about through my inspections is how I found out about it. Because you already noted, like in your case, you saw a stain, you probably noted on your ABID already, noted in master bedroom, whatever, okay?
Yeah.
We don't say what it is, we just note it as a stain. So you already have that documented, and now you're just going further in the inspection to ascertain what the damage is or what it's going to take to remedy that. And you're also going to be asking the listing agent. So for me, I'm not going to be revising my ABID. I've already noted the stain, but if this is going to take me over my days for inspection, I'm going to ask for an extension to handle that inspection.
And another question was, so if the seller doesn't want to do the termite, Do we have to send one or do we have to ask the buyer? Would you like to send a termite inspector as well?
Yeah, that's
no?
completely up to the buyer, okay, because it is a negotiated
Item.
item. So it's up to the buyer. If the buyer
Mhm.
is handy or has, some background, or maybe they have a friend that's in the business, maybe they'll say, hey, let me take a look. Sometimes the home inspector, but don't think of them as a termite inspector, but maybe they'll notice some active infestation. Or if the buyer's handy and can walk around and look, they can do that. But it isn't, unless the loan requires it, and I believe FHA and VA do require a clearance. But if the loan's not requiring it, or if you're paying cash and the buyer doesn't want to do that or elect to do it, you don't have to do it.
Mhm.
That's a
All right, thank
negotiating
you.
point. Uh-huh.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Are there any other questions? Anything we can help you with? Uh-huh.
Can you give us a gist, the ABID disclosure, ABID?
Yeah, so Jeffrey's asking for the AVID disclosure. I'm gonna go over that offline and with him, but we will be continuing through the contract and disclosures, because anything we learn, we want to convey to you, and we want everybody to feel comfortable. So we'll continue on. If there's any other questions or things that you're gonna need help on, put it in the chat box. I'll get in touch with you, or we'll pull it into training. Or if you need a question answered, call one of us and we'll be happy to answer you. So I wanted to wish you all a happy day, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And it is always my great honor and pleasure to be here with you and providing training for Coldwell Banker George Realty. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.